They never once thought to wonder what I understood. That was their first mistake. And for 20 years, it was the only one I needed. My name is Nadia. At least, that is the name they gave me when they dragged me off the ship in Charleston Harbour on a grey November morning in 1823, my wrists raw from the irons, my stomach hollow from 3 weeks of nothing but salted pork and brackish water. They wrote it in the ledger with the same indifferent hand they used to record the price of cotton and the weight of livestock. Nadia. One word. No family name. No history. No past. Just a word to put next to a number. But my real name, the name my mother whispered over me the morning I was born, the name that meant she who arrives before the storm in my language, that name I kept locked somewhere no iron could reach. I was 16 years old, and I already spoke English better than half the men who bought me. I had learned it from a missionary named Brother Thomas, a thin, quiet Englishman who had come to our village on the coast of what they called the Ivory Coast, carrying a Bible and a sack of dried beans. He was not a cruel man. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a well-meaning man in a world that punished the people his good intentions touched. For 2 years he taught me English in exchange for help translating his sermons into our dialect. I was quick. He said I had a gift. I did not know then that the gift would save my life. I did not know it would cost me 20 years of pretending I had no voice at all. When the slavers came, Brother Thomas was in the next village. He came back to find ash and silence. I never saw him again. I arrived in Charleston already knowing what captivity would demand of me. I had watched, in the days on the ship, what happened to the ones who talked back. To the ones who were too proud, too loud, too visibly intelligent. I saw a man whipped until his spine showed because he had corrected a sailor's arithmetic. I saw a woman thrown overboard because she had spoken to a guard in his own language, and he had been frightened by it. And frightened men with power are the most dangerous creatures God ever made. So I made my decision before we even docked. I would be silent. Not broken. Silent. There is a difference that most people never learn to see. The broken ones have emptiness behind their eyes. I kept mine full. I kept mine burning. I just made sure that no one who looked at me would ever think to look closely enough to notice the fire. They put us on a platform in the middle of a dirt square that smelled of horse manure and pipe tobacco. Men walked around us with the same expression they wore looking at horses. They opened our mouths to check our teeth. They squeezed our arms to test the muscle. I stood still and looked at a point just above their heads, the way I had seen cattle do, the way I had decided I would do, present in body, absent in expression, costing them nothing worth fearing. Colonel Richard Whitmore bought me for $62. He was not what I expected. He was not the red-faced, bellowing monster I had braced myself for. He was a man of perhaps 50, trim and pale, with careful grey eyes and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from absolute certainty of one's own power. He wore a good coat. His boots were clean. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is considering for a specific room. Practical, dispassionate, already decided. "She looks healthy," he said to the auctioneer. "Yes, sir. Strong back, no disease, no trouble on the crossing." "Does she speak?" "Not a word of English, sir. Fresh off the boat." Whitmore looked at me directly then. I looked back at him with the carefully cultivated blankness I had been rehearsing since Charleston Harbour. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. "Good," he said. "I have no use for ones that talk." He could not have known in that moment that he had just handed me the most powerful weapon I would ever hold. The Whitmore plantation sat 14 miles outside Charleston, down a road lined with oak trees so old and enormous that their branches met overhead and turned the midday sun into shadow. The house was white and tall, and surrounded by immaculate gardens that enslaved hands maintained with brutal precision. There were 43 of us on that land. I counted on my first day and never stopped counting. I was assigned to the house. This was, I understood immediately, either a stroke of extraordinary luck or a carefully laid trap. Housework meant proximity to the family, to their conversations, to the paper and ink and books that lined the Colonel's study. It meant sleeping in a small room off the kitchen instead of the quarters, which meant marginally less exposure and marginally more rest. But it also meant I would be watched more closely, tested more often, required to be more perfectly invisible. I chose to see it as luck. And then I chose to make it into something more. The Colonel's household consisted of himself, his wife Margaret, their 2 adult sons, James and Peter, and a rotating assembly of guests, business associates and political acquaintances who came for dinners and stayed for days. The house was almost never quiet. There was always someone talking in the parlour, someone arguing in the study, someone negotiating over a late supper while I moved through the room, refilling glasses and carrying plates, and being to all of them absolutely nothing. I learned everything. I learned that Colonel Whitmore's prosperous reputation was built on something far darker than cotton. He ran a secondary operation, careful and quiet and extraordinarily profitable, in which enslaved people were bought through illegal channels, smuggled in after the official ban on importing slaves, their existence unrecorded, their sale untaxed, their lives worth nothing on any legal document. He had connections in the ports, men he paid to look away, judges he had helped elect who returned the favour in kind. He had a partner in Savannah named Cornelius Hatch, a name I heard so many times in so many careful whispers that I began to feel I knew the man personally. I learned that the jovial, well-liked magistrate who came to Sunday dinners was on Whitmore's payroll. I learned that the minister who prayed over us in the field chapel had signed documents falsifying the origin of 3 shipments of human beings. I learned that Peter, the younger son, had a gambling problem that his father was quietly paying down to prevent a scandal, and that James, the elder, had a secret he kept in a boarding house in the city. A woman, free and black, and a son who was 3 years old and looked exactly like him. None of them imagined that the woman sweeping the floor 10 feet away understood every syllable. I kept everything in my mind the way my mother had taught me to keep stories, organised, layered, precise, each detail nested inside a larger pattern. I did not write things down. I could read, but I could not risk being found with written records. My memory became my archive. My silence became my vault. Years passed. I want to be honest about what those years were. They were not bearable because of some inner strength that made me impervious to suffering. They were bearable because I had a purpose, and purpose is the only thing that can hold a person together when everything else is being systematically dismantled. There were mornings I woke before dawn in my small room off the kitchen and felt the weight of it so completely that breathing seemed like more effort than it was worth. There were nights I lay awake and thought about everyone I had lost, my mother, my brothers, my village, my name, the missionary who had accidentally prepared me for this. And the grief of it was a physical thing, something with mass and temperature, pressing down on my chest. But then I would hear Whitmore in the next room, talking, always so certain of his safety, and I would remember what I was building, brick by brick, secret by secret, year by year. I was building a weapon. I met Marcus in my 4th year on the plantation. He was a free man, one of the few in that county who had managed to sustain that status without being destroyed by the constant machinery designed to undo it. He was a blacksmith, operating a small forge on the edge of town, and he came to the Whitmore property occasionally to repair tools and shoe horses. He was tall and deliberate in his movements, with hands that were scarred from years at the anvil, and eyes that were not fooled by very much. He did not speak to me the first time he came, or the second. He was careful, a free black man who understood precisely how precarious that freedom was, and who had survived by taking nothing for granted and trusting almost no one. It was on his 3rd visit that he looked at me, while we were both near the stables and no one else was present, and said quietly in a tone that was not quite a question, "You understand what they're saying in there?" I did not respond. I looked at him with the same blankness I used for everyone. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something. "All right," he said. "Whenever you're ready." And he went back to his work. I thought about that for 3 months before I spoke to him. When I finally did, at the edge of the river on a cold Sunday afternoon, I spoke for 2 hours. I had been silent for so long that the words came out of me like water from a dam that had been holding back more than it was designed to hold. I told him everything, not all the details, not yet, but the shape of it, what I had heard, What I knew. What I had been building toward. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "What do you want to do with it?" he finally asked. "I want to destroy him," I said. "Not escape. Not survive. Destroy." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's going to take planning." "I've had 4 years," I said. "I have a plan." What I had, more precisely, was the beginning of a plan, the architecture of it, the understanding of which pieces would need to fall in which order to make the structure collapse completely and irreparably. But a plan like the one I was imagining could not be executed alone. I needed someone on the outside. Someone who could move freely, carry information, make contact with people I could not reach from inside Whitmore's house. Marcus became that person. Carefully, incrementally, over the next several years, he became the hands for what I had in my head. We were not reckless about it. Recklessness would have killed us both. We met when we could, perhaps 6 times a year, always in circumstances that could be explained innocuously, always briefly, always with the full awareness that if anyone suspected the content of our conversations, we would not survive the week. We communicated in a system of small signals I developed, a particular way of positioning a water bucket, a specific pattern in how I folded the linens hung to dry on the line outside, code so embedded in the ordinary texture of daily work that they were invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. I taught myself patience the way other people teach themselves crafts. Deliberately, with practice, with the understanding that impatience was a luxury I could not afford. The years continued to pass. I will not pretend that my relationship with Marcus remained purely strategic. By the time a decade had gone by, we knew each other in the way that people who share a dangerous secret come to know each other, completely, carefully, with a kind of intimacy that has no word for it, because it exists outside the ordinary categories of human connection. He was my witness, I was his. We were each other's proof that we were real, that what we were doing mattered, that the years of waiting were not simply being consumed by nothing. He asked me once, sitting at the edge of the river in the dark, if I was angry. "Every day," I said. "Does it help?" he asked. "It keeps me precise," I said. "Anger without precision is just noise. I need it sharp." He nodded. "When?" he asked. It was the question underneath every conversation we had ever had. "Not yet," I said. "Whitmore's network is still too intact. If I move before Hatch's operation is exposed, he'll just rebuild. I need them both." Marcus looked at me. "You know," he said quietly, "most people wouldn't wait this long." "Most people," I said, "are not building what I'm building." The breaking point came in the 15th year, and it did not come from me. It came from a man named George Alcott, a mid-level merchant from Savannah who had been loosely involved in Whitmore's smuggling operation for several years and who had, apparently, developed a conscience, or more likely, a fear of exposure after a competing operation was raided by federal authorities in Mobile. Alcott came to the Whitmore house on a Tuesday evening in early spring, unannounced, his face carrying the particular pallor of a man who has recently realised that the walls he has been building around himself are not walls at all, but a cage. I served them supper. I refilled their glasses. I was, as always, invisible. Alcott told Whitmore that he was out, that he was done, that he had a family and could not risk the exposure. He was not threatening. He was pleading, in the naked, undignified way of a frightened man who has too much to lose and not enough spine to carry the weight of it quietly. Whitmore listened to all of it with his characteristic stillness. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, in a tone so conversational it was almost more frightening than shouting, "George, I understand your concerns. But I need you to think very carefully about what you know and what I know, because the only way you walk away from this is if I allow it. And the only reason I would allow it is if I was confident that your silence is permanent." The implication was unmistakable. Alcott left the next morning. I watched him from the window as his carriage disappeared down the oak-lined road, and I felt something I had not permitted myself to feel in a very long time, a cold, specific fear. Not for myself, for him, because I had spent 15 years listening to Richard Whitmore, and I knew exactly what that tone meant. I knew the particular mathematics of a man who views human beings as variables in an equation, and who removes variables when they become inconvenient. 9 days later, Alcott was found dead on a road outside Savannah. His death was ruled a robbery. I was carrying a breakfast tray when Marcus found a way to get the news to me. I set the tray down on the kitchen table, and I stood very still for a long moment, and I felt the weight of 15 years of accumulated patience press down on me all at once, not breaking me, but reshaping me, the way sustained pressure reshapes stone. Alcott had been a guilty man, complicit in things I could not forgive. But he had also been a frightened man who had tried, however feebly, to step away, and Whitmore had erased him like a line of ink. I thought about the 42 other people on that land. I thought about how many George Alcotts had come before him, how many quiet erasures I had witnessed and catalogued and stored, how long I had been telling myself that waiting was strategy, and not something else, not something that looked, in certain lights, uncomfortably like fear of my own. I was done waiting. That night at the edge of the river, I told Marcus, "It's time." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between relief and fear, the expression of a man who has been braced for a blow for so long that when it finally comes, he is not sure whether to brace harder or finally let go. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've been sure for 16 years, I said. I was just waiting until I could make it permanent. What followed was not a single dramatic act. It was a sequence, deliberate, careful, irreversible, each step designed to close off the exit before the next door opened. The first piece was a letter. Marcus had, over years of careful cultivation, developed a relationship with a federal attorney in Charleston named Edmund Prescott, a man who had built his career on prosecuting illegal slave trading operations, and who had the rare combination of genuine conviction and enough political insulation to use it. Marcus had never told him about me. He had never mentioned the source of the information he occasionally, obliquely passed along. But Prescott trusted him, and trust, I had learned, was the only currency that compounded without losing value. I dictated the letter to Marcus across 3 separate meetings, and I was precise in a way that only 20 years of memorization can produce. Names, dates, locations, amounts, the names of the ships, the ports of entry, the false documentation used, the men who had signed and witnessed it. I gave him Cornelius Hatch in Savannah. I gave him the magistrate who came to Sunday dinners, whose name appeared in 3 separate transactions, whose signature matched documents I had read upside down from across a desk during a dinner party in 1831. I gave him the minister who had prayed over us in the field chapel while signing papers that declared human beings to be cargo. I gave him the judge in Columbia. I gave Prescott 15 years of flawless, sourced, cross-referenced evidence, delivered through a free black blacksmith, attributed to no one. I gave him everything except my own name. The second piece was James. James Whitmore, the eldest son, had carried his secret for years. The woman in the city, their son, now 6 years old, growing up in a boarding house with his mother, while his father rode horses on a plantation and attended church on Sundays, and shook hands with important men. I knew that Whitmore held this over James not out of cruelty, but out of control, the way men like him held everything. Not to punish, but to own. James was not a good man, but he was a frightened one, and frightened men, I had found, can be moved in directions that good men cannot, because good men sometimes choose principle over survival, and frightened men almost never do. I got a message to James through a network of connections that took 3 months and extraordinary care to establish. The message was simple. I know what your father does. I know what he did to George Alcott. And I know that the federal investigation that is already moving toward this house will not distinguish between a man who ran the operation and a man who knew about it and said nothing. You have a son who deserves a father who is alive and free. There is a way to make that possible. But the door closes in 10 days. James came forward as a witness 8 days later. He did not know it was me. He could not have imagined it. As far as Richard Whitmore and every person in that house knew, Nadia did not understand a single word of English. The third piece was Margaret. and this one I did not plan. It happened in the way that the most consequential things sometimes happen, not by design, but by honesty arriving at the moment when it can no longer be delayed. 2 days before the federal marshals were due to arrive, I was in the upstairs hallway when I heard Margaret weeping. Not the polite, contained weeping of a woman performing grief, but the raw, airless kind, the sound of someone finally understanding something they had been protecting themselves from understanding for a very long time. I stopped outside her door. I do not know precisely what had reached her. Perhaps James, in his preparations to cooperate, had said something. Perhaps some piece of the truth had finally penetrated the careful architecture of not knowing that she had constructed around herself across 3 decades of marriage. I stood there for a long moment. Then I opened the door. She looked up at me from the chair by the window, her face stripped of every social layer, and I saw in her something I had not expected to find. Not the wife of my captor, not the mistress of the house where I had been held, but simply a woman who had just had the ground fall away beneath her and did not know how to stand. I set down the linens I had been carrying, and in English, clean, unaccented, fluent English, I said, "You are going to be all right." The sound that came out of her was something between a gasp and a sob. She stared at me as though I had transformed into something she had no category for. Perhaps I had. "How long?" she whispered. "Since before I arrived," I said. We looked at each other across the room, across 20 years, across every structure that had been built to make this conversation impossible, and I watched something shift in her face. Not absolution, not reconciliation, nothing so clean as either of those. Something more complicated. The particular expression of a person who has been forced to see all at once the full dimensions of a world they had chosen not to examine. "I didn't know about all of it," she said. It was not a defence, it was a confession. "I know," I said. "I know exactly what you knew and when you knew it. That will matter, in what comes next." I picked up the linens and left. I have thought about that moment many times since. I have wondered whether telling her was a mistake, whether it gave her too much warning, whether it was a crack in the precision I had maintained for so long. But I think, in the end, it was not about strategy. It was about refusing, in the final hours, to remain invisible to every single person in that house. Margaret had never been my enemy in the way Whitmore was, and I had spent 20 years being unseen. I wanted, at least once, for one person in that house to know that I had been there the whole time. She did not warn him. I had known she wouldn't. I served breakfast on Wednesday morning as I had served it every morning for 20 years. I carried the tray into the dining room. I set the plates. I poured the coffee. Whitmore looked up at me as I moved around the table, and for a moment, perhaps because the stress of the preceding days had cracked some layer of his usual composure, he looked at me not as furniture, but as a person. It was a brief thing, a flicker, the look of a man who has spent so long certain of something that he has never once stopped to question it. I looked back at him with the face I had been wearing for 20 years, empty, patient, absent. He looked away. 20 minutes later, the federal marshals came through the front door. I stood in the hallway as they moved past me. As Whitmore was led out of his own house in handcuffs, his careful grey eyes finally showing something that might have been, for the first time in the 20 years I had known him, genuine surprise. As Margaret stood at the top of the stairs with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears running silently down her face, watching the man she had built her life around being walked out of it, as James stood in the parlour doorway with the expression of a man who has just set down something very heavy and is not yet sure whether his hands are free or simply empty. No one looked at me. No one ever looked at me. In the weeks that followed, as the legal proceedings cascaded outward, Hatch arrested in Savannah the same morning, the magistrate negotiating a deal by Thursday, the minister confessing by Friday, the judge in Columbia suddenly finding urgent reasons to cooperate with federal investigators. Prescott's office began the work of accounting for every person who had been held on Whitmore land. It was slow, imperfect, insufficient work. No legal process could return what had been taken. No document could restore what those years had cost. But through mechanisms that Marcus had quietly helped set in motion months before, the 42 people who had shared that land with me were identified as victims rather than property, a distinction that opened doors that had been sealed since before most of them were born. I thought about them constantly in those final days. The 42 who had not had the accident of Brother Thomas, the accident of language, the specific combination of circumstance and decision that had made my particular form of resistance possible. I had not saved them. I wanted to be precise about that. What I had done with them as my reason, but not as my instrument. They had survived through their own endurance, their own courage, their own forms of resistance that no one had thought to record, because the people who controlled the records had never imagined there was anything worth noting. I walked out on a Thursday afternoon in April, carrying nothing that had not already been mine before the ship. Marcus was waiting at the end of the road. We did not speak for a long time. We stood at the edge of the property, looking back at the White House with its perfect gardens and its enormous ancient trees, draped in the particular golden light of a Carolina spring afternoon. And I thought about the 16-year-old girl who had stood on that platform in the dirt square and made her decision. She had been right. The silence had worked. But what she had not known, what I only understood now, standing in the road with 20 years finally lifted from my shoulders, was that the silence had never been the point. The silence was the container. What mattered was what I had been filling it with, year by year, secret by secret, in the careful, patient architecture of a future that no one who owned me had ever thought to imagine. They thought silence meant surrender. They had never considered that it might mean aim. Marcus took my hand, and we walked away from that road and did not look back, because the past was not where we were going. And I had spent enough of my life moving through spaces that were not built for me. My name is not Nadia. My name means she who arrives before the storm. I always thought that was about destruction. Standing in that road, watching the house that had held me for 2 decades begin, in some essential way, to simply cease to be what it had been. The colonel in federal custody, his network dismantled, his name becoming in the mouths of Charleston society, a word people said carefully and then looked away from. I understood that I had been wrong about what the storm was. It was not the ending. It was me. It had always been me. And I had arrived exactly on time.